Hello, everyone. My name is Kai Pe. I'm a professor of international relations at Griffith University in Australia. Today, I'm also wearing another hat as a senior research fellow at the Toda Peace Institute in Tokyo, Japan. It is my great honor and pleasure to host today's public conversation with Professor T.V. from McGill University in Canada. Today's conversation will focus on one of the most important questions in world politics. Is peaceful change still possible in an increasingly turbulent international system? At the time of profound international uncertainty, the central challenge is not only to understand how international orders change, but also to ask whether such change can be managed without large-scale war, systemic breakdown, or prolonged confrontation. The concept of peaceful change directs our attention to the conditions, institutions, and actors that may help states adapt to shifting power, interests, and identities through negotiation, accommodation, and institutional adjustment rather than coercion or violence. We are delighted to explore those questions with Professor T.V. my longtime friend, one of the world's leading scholars of international relations, and a leading figure in the revival of the study of peaceful change in world politics. Professor Paul is Distinguished James McGill Professor in the Department of Political Science at McGill University. His research focuses on international relations, particularly international security, regional security, and South Asia. He is the author or editor of 24 books and nearly 85 journal articles and book chapters. In September 2018, he was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. He also served as the 56th President of the International Studies Association from 2016 to 2017. Welcome, TV, to Toda's public conversation.
I'm really delighted to join you today to engage you on a very crucial topic that you have identified.
Okay, let me begin with a question on the current international order. Scholars and policymakers increasingly debate whether the current international order is undergoing a transition or facing a more fundamental rupture. Earlier this year, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney warned that the world may be entering a period of profound order disruption. At the same time, the wars in Ukraine and the Middle East, coupled with intensifying great power rivalry, have raised concerns about a new Cold War or even the possibility of World War III. So how do you assess the current state of the international order? Are we witnessing an order transition, an order rupture, or something in between? Thank you, TV.
That's a very interesting question. I would say something in between. Rupture in some sense, especially coming from the United States, engaging in a sort of revisionist strategy, as we may call it. Clearly, it is not all bad news. I will tell you what good news there, but bad news first. Obviously, the system must be noticed. With the end of the Cold War, there was a moment of hubris for the Western liberal order, and the United States emerged as this leading power, and then wanted to reshape the world, especially after 9/11. And in that process, it engaged in some extreme violence in some regions, especially in the Middle East. And none of those efforts have succeeded to create a peaceful regional order. But the positive thing was the United States supported, to some extent, the deepening of globalization. Globalization, the phenomenon that we know, has been in existence since humans left Africa. But clearly, the deepened globalization of the current phase is the post-Cold War period. Companies, multinational corporations began to expand, and a number of trade deals all over the world, investment, technology development. And so this economic dimension and migration of skilled labor from different parts of the world helped especially countries like China and India. And some of the others, Brazil, Indonesia, I'm just listing only a few, the so-called G20 benefited from this process. So then globalization then created fantastic growth for these countries consistently, but not necessarily for everyone living in these countries, especially in the United States. And so the class divisions have increased. And so at the domestic level, it's creating pressures on political elite to abandon and create a kind of deglobalized world, or going back to the kind of autarkic world. But that hasn't happened. Let me be very brief there. As feared, partly because globalization's roots have now gone beyond the United States. There's only so much the US can really control the world market. It has a few capacities, the dollar power, the SIPT currency mechanism, etc. But clearly it is losing some of that advantage. At the same time, the emerging powers do not want to abandon globalization. And they are definitely continuing the trade relationships. And they are creating their own bilateral and regional deals, and they are happening simultaneously. So what Prime Minister Carney said was right to some extent, but it is a moment of reckoning and a moment of realizing that our time has come to be more proactive. You can't rely on this powerful state alone, an ally that for 75 years or more helped us. But now we have to think of our own ways. And that is not a bad thing. And indeed, one can argue that countries like Canada may, in the end, benefit from this process because you have a bit more agency. If you are so reliant on the United States for your protection, your security, then you have not much agency, not much freedom of action. So strategic autonomy, the concept that often we hear, is feasible up to a point. And clearly, nobody is coming out openly to say too many things, but they are working behind the scenes. That's one. The number two is why it's not a big rupture, because previous great power competitions, European era to World War I, World War II, world was divided vertically and horizontally. You have polarity, you have multiple countries joining alliances and creating this offensive coalitions. That is missing today. Not a single country has joined the United States, as far as I know, of any significance in terms of supporting its actions in the Middle East today, the Iran war I'm talking about. And even the Gulf countries who are supposed to be protected by the United States are not reacting as one would expect. And if you look around the world, the United States is powerful, but its power is constrained by asymmetrical strategies of second-ranking states. So in a way, the United States is going through this painful ordeal of transition to a great power, probably co-equal to China to some extent. But all that process is difficult. It's called status adjustment. It is status anxiety for these big powers. In the meantime, Russia, of course, is the wild card here, which upset the European order by invading Ukraine. But there also, Ukraine is making some headway or preventing Russia from taking over completely, which all shows that the second-ranking actors, not only in the economic arena, but in the security arena too, have some capacity to resist. This was not the case much of human history. And that's why I'm somewhat positive that these great powers are also restrained in using their nuclear weapons, for instance. Why haven't China, Russia, US haven't used it? So there are a few positive elements there, but nothing is predictable in international politics. When transitions occur, sometimes all you need is a very ambitious, highly offense-oriented strategy and a leader to support that. And some of those elements are there in countries like the US today. But there is also a countervailing force that the US has. Hopefully, they will prevail at some point. But clearly, it is not the world that they were hoping would emerge. It is declining power in many sense, relatively. But then the other positive, let me conclude by saying that China is not reacting just like what European powers did for a rising power. It is rising much more measured, much more prudently than the European counterparts, even Japan did. So there's not in a big hurry to get there for China or even India for that matter. And they are slowly building up their capacity. So the question is, will there be a rupture in the Pacific? Will there be a rupture in Europe? Will someone decide to accelerate their transition to more favorable conditions? All those are important. Finally, I would say the technological developments are something that we need to watch. If technology allows offense over defense and deterrence in the military domain, that's bad news. All it needs is then a very powerful leader to make use of this available capability. But at this moment, it's diffused. It's a lot more spread out. It's not concentrated except one or two domains. And that the world is going through rapid change in that domain as well.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much, TV, for your insightful comments on the current international order, especially on the positive side of the potential order change. Let me now turn to the concept of peaceful change, which has been at the center of your scholarship for many years. You have been one of the leading scholars advancing the idea of peaceful change in international politics. In your ISA presidential address in 2016, you outlined several pathways through which states can accommodate major shifts in power and interest without resorting to war. So, what do you mean by peaceful change? Why it is important for understanding international politics today, and what conditions make peaceful change more likely? Thank you very much.
Big question, and obviously you also were part of some of the projects we did. We did actually an Oxford Handbook on Peaceful Change, which has got 43 chapters on various dimensions. I think we have to look at two or three dimensions here. One is what's the area where we are talking about? Global peaceful change or international peaceful change, interstate peaceful change, bilateral, regional peaceful change. Then, of course, there is a domestic peaceful change. That is what democracy is supposed to do. Peaceful power transfer, for instance. But peaceful change in international relations is what we are focusing mostly, given our research interest, which has been, by the way, a focal point of our discipline for a long time. Long time means since during the interwar period, there were considerable debates about this subject. What should be the strategy to accommodate, to make rising Germany, accommodate them to avoid another war? That was the work of E.H. Carr and others. His famous book, 20 Years Crisis, was indeed a pioneering work in our field. So this debate has occurred during that time. In fact, lots of conferences, meetings. And they had an immediate reason for that because they were witnessing yet another war going to happen if we don't somehow pacify this German anchor. Germany was humiliated in World War One at Versailles, and that it was trying to reemerge as this most aggressive power in human history in many ways. And so they were working on that. But then war happened, war ended, and then you have Cold War. Peaceful change lost its value. Then the Cold War ended without a fight, only limited challenges here and there. And that really people started thinking in our discipline, constructivists, for instance, started talking about change without war and the ideational change that happened in the Soviet system under Mikhail Gorbachev. But then we have witnessed the rise of the United States and then the rise of China happening. So in a sense, we are at a moment, some say 1920s, 30s, but I think that's not entirely true. But in terms of the power capacities of these two actors, they're rapidly changing, especially China's. And there are a few other actors as well. So we worry that, at least from our point of view, whether this will produce extraordinary conflict as much of historical experience of when a new power rises, it produces potential conflict. And that's where it started. So essentially what peaceful change means, change without war, without the use of force or use of coercive force, as well as actual use of weapons in war. So if we can come to conclusions, agreements on how to share particular resources, or in some cases territory, or in some cases status adjustment, institutional power, etc. And that without a war or a coercive force is valuable compared to what the alternative is, as we are witnessing in the Middle East today. The war is really producing so many externalities, so many outcomes that nobody thought would happen, such as the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, for instance. So that's a minimalist understanding of peaceful change, agreements without war or conflict, a military conflict. But there is a maximalist and that's in between category. The maximalist view is change for what? Change should help people, change should produce justice, changes produce legitimacy, equitable feeling of that we also won kind of thing. And that a permanent peace, not a short-term tactical advancement of one's goals or not. Permanent peace is, of course, or what Immanuel Kant calls perpetual peace, is always the dream of philosophers and some of us who work in this area. But it's always very difficult to get there. So what are the steps? And then in between category, which means some level of potential for conflict is there, but peace is institutionalized. The European Union is a great example. They have created a peace among themselves. But I would also caution that they have a very difficult time creating peace outside their zone, which is part of their big challenge, because they can be very violent without knowing, just like the United States. Liberal thinkers think that they're very peaceful, but they have a tendency to engage in violence beyond their zone or enable violence, not necessarily directly. So, but in any case, the question is, in international relations, it is definitely among the great powers, among the regional states, among small state versus big states. And so there are these dimensions at the great power level. We worry about it most. Why? They can cause the greatest harm to humanity if they end up in war. As history tells us, it's those two world wars that shaped the whole human, all the outcomes that created Second World War. Some 50 million people died. First World War, some say some 20 million. And clearly, it's not the death, the destruction of empires in World War One. In World War Two, you have massive uh, suffering caused by war. And then, of course, it produced some outcomes such as the end of the empires and the decolonization. One doesn't want to give all the credit to that. Of course, the agency of the nationalist movements were very important. But here, what we are witnessed is that such a war before the nuclear age, the war ended with U.S. using nuclear weapons on Japan, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki, massive suffering for the Japanese victims of it. But it taught people a lesson that this absolute weapon should never be used. It is the unwinnability of war, as Bernard Brodie cautioned us, that we are worried about. And today, you have seen that massive increase in nuclear capabilities, but it seems like a great power war, even if it doesn't escalate to nuclear level, can indeed cause all kinds of consequences, not just for the great powers themselves, but for regional states. When great powers contest, they are contesting over spheres of influence. They want to dominate a certain set of countries, especially the weak ones. So when they fight, they go into their territories directly or indirectly. And that often causes extraordinary suffering. Now, we know that the wars in the Middle East, for instance, some say killed millions of people since the end of the Cold War in Iraq, in Libya, in Syria. Now, not all caused by great powers, but the great powers, especially the United States, played a big role in many of these wars. Retributional wars, sometimes without a real cause, such as the Iraq War. Saddam Hussein did not have nuclear weapons, but the US made up a story and then now suffered as a result. Afghanistan, of course, was different in a sense. So there are two types of wars, wars of choice and wars of necessity. Some say a war against Taliban was a war of necessity, but the war against Mr. Saddam Hussein was a war of choice. And the war now happening in Iran is also a war of choice. These wars have started and with the expectation that somehow these weaker parties, so-called weaker parties, will give up and concede easily. They don't often because they will fight back if they can. If they have some choking point, they have some leverage they can use, which can be a strategy, which can be weapons, or they can outlast, as the Taliban showed in Afghanistan. So, but the wars are very much part of the military establishment's thinking. They don't think about peaceful change, for instance, as a strategy. How do you get there without a war is missing in our diplomatic lingo often. The advantage of war is weapons are in your hands. The leaders can use them. Peace is not in your hands. Of course, you can propose peace. The other side has to accept. The temptation is very high for a powerful country that doesn't suffer the consequences of war as much as the victim. So United States doesn't get, of course, the oil price going up. That's it, basically, but few casualties. But it is this who are suffering, the ordinary people in the Middle East and the rest of the world. So that's why we think many times leaders are insensitive to peaceful change. They could do a lot more to educate themselves, come up with strategies, and to avoid these kind of cataclysmic wars without an exit strategy. They think they go with the illusion, what they call short war illusion. And then they struggle. They cannot get out easily. And they get into this escalation pattern. So today I worry about this, the recent flare up against Iran, even though President Trump thinks he can call off any time. But the escalation has its logic. And that logic hopefully won't lead to a deepening of conflict.
Thank you very much, TV, for sharing your insights on the history, the conceptualization, and also the importance of peaceful change for world politics today. So you mentioned institution a little bit in your discussion, let me zoom in to the role of international institutions for peaceful change. International organizations have played a central role in managing international order since the end of the Second World War. Yet many observers have become increasingly skeptical about their effectiveness. Critics point to the inability of those institutions, such as the UN, to prevent or resolve conflict in Ukraine and also you mentioned the Middle East. So, what role can international institutions play in managing contemporary order change? Can they still facilitate peaceful change shifts, or we call the orderly transition among major powers? Will regional organization play an especially important role in the years ahead? Thank you.
So here again, the picture is mixed. I would argue that the UN Security Council is a total failure, but the General Assembly is not. It is a parliament of the world. There, they are performing their role. They come up with resolutions. They have, in fact, come up with a lot of ideas. The whole idea of decolonization resolution happened in General Assembly. The Security Council, the permanent five and the elected 10, of course, don't have a lot of power, but the permanent five are to be blamed for the current stalemate. In that, of course, the United States, because that's kind of the power that is the biggest contributor to these institutions economically as well as other ways. So what is happening? I have argued elsewhere that institutions have a lifespan. Institutions don't live forever. We somehow think that, and that applies to democracy as an institution, by the way. Institutions need nurturing, especially those created in a post-war settlements. So the UN was created in post-war settlement in 1945 in San Francisco. The world has changed. The power capacities of different actors have changed. But the P5, or the permanent five, is still clinging on to that power. So it has great difficulty adjusting and adapting to the changing power situation. So in a way, if it cannot succeed, maybe we need to think of another institution. That's where the G20, I was hopeful that would emerge as more powerful or at least as good as a UN setup, given that it has all these others who are much more materially superior today than Britain and France, for instance, or even Russia, but don't have representation. So institutional reform became very difficult. That's one. The second is institutions were created to solve problems in the post-war period. They don't have the long-term vision. Of course, some do. Constitutions are supposed to offer that. But look at the United States. Its constitution was created with the great ideas. And if you read some of the Federalist Papers, they were actually trying to prevent exactly the rise of an emperor or an autocrat. And look where we are. But the point I'm trying to say is that institutions require nurturing. And when it comes to security matters, it is powerful states. But if they don't agree on what constitutes international order, regional order, peace, and if they are driven by only selfish relative gains ideas or domination, then we have a problem. I think that's what we are facing. Why I said I have a mixed opinion on it. You find some other institutions are working to some extent. You mentioned regional institutions. I think ASEAN is a reasonably successful story. Or European Union, despite its challenges from the United States. They haven't collapsed. They are meeting. They are engaging in a lot of activities. And we know that NATO just held a meeting and, of course, some challenges there with the President Trump. But whenever there is an ASEAN meeting, all the leaders of the world show up. Why are they there if the institutions are no value for them? So there is something about institutions. Institutions are not a panacea for all the ills of the world. And we put a lot of emphasis on conflict resolution to institutions. That can happen only if leaders agree to the institutional mediation institutional help in creating. Often that's why peacekeeping functions of the UN haven't been very successful in building peace. But once the peace settlements comes in, you need somebody to go in and start peacekeeping. And that's some success there. It's not totally failure. The African Union, reasonably successful. Of course, you have failures in South Asia. East Asia also, you have trade-related institutions. You have in Latin America, Mercosur countries, not that great, successful, but there are some limited successes going on. And even the UN, some of its subsidiary institutions, WHO, of course, people had a lot of problems. But the point is, imagine a world without WHO. WHO is absolutely needed. WTO, the World Trade Organization. I think countries are still going there, by the way, with their complaints and winning sometimes. There are UNICEF, UNESCO, all these are functioning in their own way. IMF, the Chinese created institutions, BRI, if you want to call it an institution, of course, the BRICS. Okay, that is a bit of a disappointment, partly because I think they are, various parties wanted different approaches. But they are there, they are meeting. The prime ministers and presidents are going, which is better than no meeting between, for instance, India and China. The leaders meeting sometimes calmed down. They had border tensions. And I know for sure that these meetings melted the ice in some context. So G20, of course, they may not be dealing with security matters as much as they should be, but they're dealing with a lot of other matters, and there is a sense of belonging. For the rising powers, institutions are very important if you want to rise peacefully. That's why when China is actively participating, it is good to see that it is not abandoning institutions. Of course, it could do a lot more or try to make others feel important in institutional settings. But the point is that rising powers are for institutions, are for some level of globalization. All that is good news for institutional development. But we may have to think of new institutions or recalibrating, readjusting. And that will require these powers to think of what is in it for world peace, what is in it for us. A lot of ideational changes need to take place in the short term and the medium term.
Thank you, TV. You provide a mixed picture about the role of institutions, some successful case and also some unsuccessful case. And if I understand you correctly, we need to reform the older global institution and even create a new global institution and also celebrate some success of those regional institutions. You talk about the rising power, but to build on that discussion, I would like to ask about the role of middle powers. As uncertainties grows about the future of the international order, increasing attention has turned to the role of middle powers. Leaders such as we just mentioned, the Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney have argued that the middle powers should work together to help stabilize the international system. In the Indo-Pacific, countries such as Australia, Japan, South Korea, Indonesia, and others have increasingly embraced we call the middle power diplomacy. So the question is, what role can middle power play in promoting peaceful change and preventing order rupture? A related question is, can they collectively shape the future of international order? Or, as some critics suggest, will their efforts ultimately be constrained by great power competition? Thank you.
Yeah, so I think at this point in time, middle powers have assumed much greater agency than I already mentioned in any historical eras. You have historical periods when the so-called middle powers of the time would jump into the bandwagon with one coalition or other, military coalitions, because war was considered as important to be part of this winning coalition. Then you get some benefits, some spoils out of it. If you don't join, then you will be ostracized, you will lose in the peace conference following. So the Europeans always had this temptation. Neutrality was only for small states. Belgium, Switzerland, Sweden was for a period of time. But clearly, that's not the case today. Middle power is the one in between great power and very small states, and that has some capacity to influence outcomes in its region and beyond, or something that gives it prominence in the global hierarchical structure. So the middle powers have realized that they cannot play according to the tune set by the great powers if they want to exist and prosper. They means their population too in this highly competitive world economy, world political system. So they are indeed at a moment where they have a chance to reduce tensions, even if they don't directly participate in peace building among these great powers, but to restrain them. The key word is restrain them. That we are not going to join you in all your unnecessary wars of choice. And that they did quite a bit, but they also failed in, I'm now thinking of the Western powers, Western middle powers, especially their wars in the Middle East. And of course, Iraq war, countries like Canada did not participate, opposed it. In fact, France and Germany opposed it. That's why the soft balancing argument comes in. But there were quite a few. Britain was with the United States, Poland, Spain, countries that join this aggressive warfare on the basis of alliance relationship. So the Western middle powers, they have a tendency to side with the United States, or in many say they kept quiet when Israel was engaging in extreme violence in Gaza, and they have sort of closed their eyes, and that is a big challenge for them. So they preach all these things, but sometimes they act in a way that is this Western coalition, the kind of a club. So if they can break out of that, I'm talking about Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and all these countries, and the Scandinavian countries, and embrace some of the other middle powers who are not Western. I would include India in that. Of course, some say it's a rising power, but maybe it's still a middle power, I think. It has aspirations, but I have written a book about this subject. But the point is that you have quite a few other countries in the ASEAN major countries. Japan, of course, is a middle power. Then there is South Korea. And even in the Middle East, you have quite a few of them. So how to create a coalition? That's kind of coalition in the sense, come up with ideas for the resolution of these intractable conflicts. This Iran war, there's an opportunity now to somehow convince the United States and Iran to avoid escalation and talk about ways to manage their conflict relationship, especially in global trade-related issues. And they are really hurting everybody, especially the poorest of the poor, because the fertilizers have to come from the Middle East for the next agricultural season. Then the oil price hurting if it is going back again to this intense price rise situation. So the middle powers really have to be a bit more proactive. Of course, they are engaging in proactive diplomacy. In fact, Prime Minister Modi was in Australia and New Zealand and Indonesia and signed quite a few bilateral deals. But the activism in preventing this unnecessary war escalating, and it's going to hurt all of them, plus the poorest of the poor countries of the world, and of course the American middle class too, or lower middle class, who really suffer any price increase in various products. So how to communicate, how to change, how to influence global public opinion. Keeping quiet is not a good idea. Of course, it is a good idea because they're afraid of Trump will personally attack them. But why not write track 2 meetings, organize seminars. I mean, why only Carney made that statement? Why nobody else has come up with yet? Which is a puzzle to me. Why don't we think about a meeting where the so-called G20, if the US doesn't want to come, don't come, make a good resolution about the need for preventing escalation. And then, of course, work through back channels, diplomacy, how to influence these countries' leaders, because they seem to be working in isolation and they don't care about the rest of the world. They're not that powerful as they think. They need to be restrained, they need to be reminded. And so I think there has to be a reckoning. The middle powers do have an opportunity, but they shouldn't jump into bandwagon the next war the US fights. Avoid just to prevent coalition building like that. Many of them provide bases, and they need to renegotiate that. Now look at the Gulf countries. None of them is protected by the US, despite all this big talk about presence of American military base. In fact, they attract attack by the Iranians. So is there a way that these base holders can communicate to the Americans? Well, your wars are hurting us because we are not really able to prevent attacks on our facilities, etc. So what I'm saying is a bit more proactive, bit more daring, bit more planned activities are needed on the part of the middle powers. It should not be a short-term ad hoc coalition. It has to be built around ideas, institutional ideas, ideas for peace, ideas for economic development, ideas for removal of poverty. We achieved a lot in the last 20, 30 years, but now we're going back to extreme poverty in many parts of the world.
Yeah, many thanks, TV, for your thoughtful comments on the importance of the agency for middle power, especially you talk about the proactive and also wise coalition building among middle powers, especially during this kind of power transition time. Let me conclude with a question about the future. So looking ahead, are you still optimistic about the peaceful change? Especially how important are US-China relations to the prospects for peaceful change? And if you were advising policymakers, what should they focus on to avoid a major power war, and facilitate a more peaceful transition to the next international order? Thank you.
Yeah. That's a big question, but I will give it a shot. I am cautiously optimistic of China rising peacefully. Peacefully means without a major war, partly because of Chinese strategy. China is making considerable advancement, and the strategy is not to create, first of all, hardly any bases in anywhere except Djibouti or some places. The BRI, despite all its criticisms, is a better way to develop co-partners than the imperial ideas of giving direct aid and then hoping that they will spend it on development, which never happened, by the way. But BRI has its own problems. I don't, but it is a better alternative than some of the other strategies. So if an advice goes to China, first of all, there is no point in fighting a war over Taiwan, fighting a war in the South China Sea. Maybe they will win, but what are the outcomes? I can tell you, Taiwan, of course, the outcomes can be extremely unpredictable. Taiwan could resist, and that resistance would mean China would not necessarily get all that it is looking for, including all those chips that Taiwan builds. So somehow befriending Taiwan and creating, even if it's possible to create a second a model. Of course, Hong Kong failed. That's why Taiwan is not willing anymore to talk about that. But the point is, it could think of alternatives. They have both parties sometimes engage. And of course, restrain countries like North Korea very important. But South China Sea is where I think China has to show a bit more prudence. There is no way China can say this ocean is ours and we will start collecting tolls at some point, as Mr. Trump just announced today. Another dumb move, if I may say so. That we will somehow manage this ocean. These countries are, as I said, they have more agency. They can resist. And China doesn't need that much resistance. It is getting what it can without use of force or coercive use of force. So that's one thing. Secondly, China will get some technological advantages if the way it is going. But it has to be careful using them. Again, short-term benefits. Long run, your credibility is very important. Your reputation is important. The United States used to have reputation in many ways, credible commitment, and that it lost it as soft power. So China would benefit having this soft power. But China also will need to engage other powers in the region, India in particular. Why do you want to create hostility with India and somehow avoid situations like the border conflict? I'm not saying it's all China's fault, but clearly there has to be an effort on the part of both sides to avoid escalatory moves. And then the other point is how to restrain Russia. Its ambitions are not going away. And that the European Union is needed. European countries have to give it some level of status and recognition. And the challenge is Ukraine doesn't want to give up any territory at this point. Countries often have disputes, even when they end wars with disputed territories. So Kashmir is disputed, but the war ended, at least direct wars, because there are limited conflicts going on. So we have a lot of theaters like that of the Palestine. It's not over, but clearly they can think of a way to prevent this warfare, in this brutal warfare, by the way, hurting Russia too in a massive way. And the Russians need to restrain their thought of expanding their influence using coercive means to rest of Eastern Europe or the ex-republics of Russia. And how do we engage that? That's where actually the middle powers can play a bit more important role, because Russia is sometimes open to, middle powers and China for that matter, open to support discussion by these powers. Putin always goes to India or to China. And there has to be a way, again, they are very inactive there, which is quite puzzling to me. There's a way to think about what does Russia want, and can we incorporate some of their ideas and create a European order. Of course, their dream of NATO dismantling is not going to happen, but clearly the question is also the European powers, how do they look at it? So all these are challenging, but we need a lot more creative ideas on the part of these great powers. Now, the United States is the most unpredictable power at this point, partly because of the domestic situation. United States is on what I would call a status anxiety mode. It is declining in relative sense. It doesn't want to give up its dominant position. It has certain advantages in military power, and it has this philosophy of extreme war to achieve its goal, as it did in world wars and later, of course, these regional theaters. So its interventions, majority of them have been failures or produce very bad outcomes. So how to communicate that to the Americans, that there is something about this tendency to unnecessarily go to wars against these global South countries, that of course some of them resist American power. And that's most of these wars are for their domination, showing they're the top dog. And they don't get anything back, the thing that they can somehow isolate themselves from repercussions. So that is a big challenge that will require a domestic change, ideational change, even among the liberals in America. The liberals also are for war sometimes. They are not as peaceful as they think. So how do we educate them that you can be a peaceful country? You can reduce this intense conflict you generate sometimes. You can also think of other ways, but the risk there is Mr. Trump just produced his next defense budget of 1.5 trillion, taking out money from all welfare schemes. What is that going to do? It will have a lot of these kinetic power. And if kinetic power is available, the countries have a tendency to use them. And that is a worrisome part. So the targets are often these weaker actors, but they are not that weak anymore. They resist. And the resistance means then this temptation is to strike hard. And strike hard means escalatory pattern. So the great powers need education, socialization into a different world order. And a lot of that can be achieved if academic work, journalistic work, all have to focus on not only what they are doing, but what they shouldn't do. Okay. And that's why in social media, I don't know, you know, Professor John Mearsheimer and Jeffrey Sachs, two very prominent guys. And Professor Mearsheimer used to be a hawk, but now he acts like he's a very peace, and he criticized this American temptation to engage in extreme violence. And I think they need to be supported. But our discipline, unfortunately, doesn't have that much of powerful figures like John. But the point I'm trying to say is that we need a movement around the world to think about transitions without war. And how do we get choices? And the idea that some leaders unfortunately think if they become rich and powerful, the world problems will go away, everybody will start liking them. These are all old ideas. So the ideational defeat of neo-imperialism, neo-racism, if you want to call it, all the things, some of the things Mr. Trump is doing, or sphere of influence, is very important. And for the middle powers, that's where you have to play a role. Do not allow it to be part of sphere of influence, if you can, okay? Sometimes you can't. And that is very critical. And I do see some level of progress, 2 steps forward, 1 step backward. But history is like that. It has never been a linear progression. That is where we make a lot of mistake. It's always, look at countries, inside countries, you know, they may have periods of prosperity, then they decline, or revolutions happen. Democratic countries could become, go back to some other mode. So all this happens. So humans have to be constantly vigilant. And that vigilance sometimes is missing because sometimes we think that it's not my business to deal with the politics of the day, or diplomats will handle it. They need education. And so our role is very important, more than we think.
Thank you, TV, for your concluding remarks. We need more education. We need more new ideas. Actually, we need a movement about peaceful change, right? Thank you very much for sharing your valuable insights with us today in our public conversation series. It has been a real pleasure speaking with you. I hope we will have another opportunity to speak in the future. Thank you.